Hi, I'm Dave Yost, the Attorney General here in Ohio, and I'm here to make a very small request of you. I want you to be a hero. No, you don't have to rescue someone from a burning building. I want you to be a different kind of hero. I want you to stop the building from catching fire in the first place, because the net result is the same. You save lives, and that is what heroes do. This is the kind of hero we need to protect our schools and our students. Someone who can prevent violence before it starts, before it ends in a tragedy in a school. When something like this happens, we often learn afterward that there were people who knew the perpetrator posed a threat, but nothing was done. It's time to stop that pattern, to reject the idea that we're helpless, because in each one of these incidents, there are at least two big failures. The first is the failure to recognize that someone was in the grip of a mental or emotional disturbance so severe that they're dangerous. The second is the failure to stop them from acting out. This just doesn't have to happen. We need to get in front of the problem before it turns into a tragedy. We know it works. In 2016, a 16-year-old student was overheard discussing a plot to attack Hilliard Davidson High School outside Columbus. Fortunately, another student reported that conversation to the school resource officer. School officials teamed up with local, state, and federal law enforcement to collect evidence, monitor, and then arrest the student. As a result, the student was prevented from acting out, and he's been getting the psychological help he so desperately needs. Most important, no one was hurt. That team, a threat assessment team, is something you can build in your school district and community. Threat assessment teams include school administrators, teachers, guidance counselors, law enforcement, mental health professionals. These teams are designed to evaluate threats, big and small, and determine whether a student or another person poses some kind of a risk, and then take steps to help that person and eliminate the risk. This 8-part training video will guide you in how to establish and participate in a threat assessment team, how to assess threats, and how to respond to them. Around our state, many of us get to do important work to get ready to save lives once a crisis begins. Now, let's put as much time and effort into identifying troubled youngsters before we reach that crisis point. We aim to prevent school violence using nationally proven best practices, not a top-down approach, but instead providing guidance to local law enforcement and school districts to fill this critical gap. These are our schools and our kids. It's our job to help them and to protect them. Thank you for participating in this training. Now, let's learn to be heroes.
Hello, I'm Kyle Anderson.
And I'm Holly Hollingsworth. We're pleased to serve as your hosts for Ohio School Threat Assessment Training.
The events at Colorado's Columbine High School in 1999 changed the way we look at violence in schools. It was 2 years after that, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, that we first saw one of the innovations which came from Columbine. In New Bedford, a student overheard several classmates discuss plans to bomb and shoot individuals at their school. That student went to a teacher, and they contacted law enforcement. During the investigation, they found bomb-making materials and the plans to carry out the attack. The New Bedford incident is the first known example of a school and law enforcement using a threat assessment to prevent an attack from occurring. One of the investigators in that case had read a report about school threat assessments conducted by the Secret Service for the Department of Education and implemented the concept.
Unlike other assessment models, the threat assessment team model attempts to interrupt people on a pathway to commit acts of violence. And in the rare case that the assessment reveals true substantive danger, law enforcement and other assessment professionals develop a plan to disrupt the chance of violence. Violence prevention is always the first goal of the threat assessment, but it's also important to determine why a student or any other individual posed a threat and to address that.
Many resources have been pooled together to develop this training, but there are two that have been essential. The first is titled Enhancing School Safety Using a Threat Assessment Model by the U.S. Secret Service. It's an operational guide developed to provide fundamental direction on how to prevent incidents of targeted school violence. It does this by establishing a threat assessment process in schools to enhance violence prevention efforts.
The other key resource is the Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines by Dr. Dewey Cornell. The purpose of this manual is to provide guidelines for school-based teams to conduct threat assessments of students who pose a threat of violence. The team can use these guidelines to conduct an assessment of the seriousness of a student's threat and determine whether the threat can be resolved quickly or will require a more extensive evaluation. These training videos will feature direct guidance from a number of experts about threat assessment.
So let's take a few minutes to meet the two people behind our two key information resources, Dr. Lena Alla of the U.S. Secret Service and Dr. Dewey Cornell of the University of Virginia.
I'm Professor Dewey Cornell. I'm a professor of education and a clinical psychologist. I've been at the University of Virginia for over 30 years doing work on school safety and youth violence prevention. And I developed a threat assessment model in 2001 with my colleagues. And we've spent the past 18 years doing research, training, and dissemination of that model. Well, the primary goal of threat assessment is always safety. Safety is always the number one goal, the primary goal. But beyond that, it's to identify a student who's in trouble, in distress, who has needs. And to try to solve the problem that that young person is dealing with. Because every threat is kind of a red flag saying, I've got a problem I can't solve. And so we take a problem-solving approach to threat assessment. We view threats as indications of a problem, and the threat assessment team is a problem-solving team. And if they can resolve that young person's problem and help get them on a pathway away from violence to being successful in their career, that's going to be the most effective way to prevent violence. And this was a process developed by the Secret Service, used initially to protect public figures, but which had been expanded to prevent workplace violence, to deal with other kinds of threatening situations. And so the idea was bubbling about in the late 90s, early 2000s, that schools might be able to adapt threat assessment for schools. And I thought, well, how would we do that? You know, it seemed like a great principle, great idea, but in practice, what would you do? And so I turned to our local schools, and I gathered together a group of educators, administration, counseling, psychology, school resource officers, and we had a work group, and we reviewed cases in our schools where threats had taken place, and what went right, what went wrong, what might be an effective, practical procedure for it. And that allowed us to develop a threat assessment set of guidelines with a decision tree and a process. And our local schools let us try it out. And so in 2001, 2002, we had 35 schools, K through 12, that evaluated 188 threat assessment cases, and it worked out very well. We learned, we made refinements, we made improvements, but we found that we could resolve every student threat of violence in a satisfactory and safe way, and that very few of these kids needed to be expelled or arrested. Most of them had problems that we could solve.
Dr. Lena Alla, Chief, United States Secret Service, National Threat Assessment Center. I manage all of the research, training, and consultation programs at the Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center so that we can make sure we're getting this information out to public safety professionals to mitigate any acts of targeted violence. A threat assessment essentially is a three-step process. You want to be able to identify individuals in the community who might be exhibiting concerning behavior or might have an unusual or threatening interest in a potential target. Once you identify those concerning individuals, you want to have protocols in place to conduct an assessment. What information should you gather so that you can assess, does this person pose a risk of violence? And if you think that they do, then you have to come up with mitigation strategies.
These training videos will also feature interviews with a number of Ohio's own state and local experts, such as Joe Knoll, the superintendent of the Marlington Local Schools in Stark County, and Dean Tendiglia, director of public safety and chief of police at Kent State University. Both utilize threat assessment protocols in their organizations. Chief Tendiglia agrees that Althari of the Secret Service and Cornell of the University of Virginia are the two ideal national information resources concerning threat assessment.
I think those two sources are a great resource for institutions that are trying to create or develop a team. And I think they're also good for institutions like ours that has a team that needs to go back and we're constantly reassessing, evaluating, learning what we need to do to improve our team. So I think those resources are really valuable. I think it gives a nice roadmap of how to get to a successful implementation of a team, and then how to deal with those threats.
To me, this is 100% prevention versus reaction, and sadly in my world sometimes we do a lot of reacting to things. But in Stark County, I'm proud to say our sheriff is leading the way on this. I'm on his safety task force here in the county, and we spend a lot of our time talking about how do we get ahead of the curve. What do we do preventative-wise? This type of a threat assessment piece being part of that versus being on the back end where all we're doing is responding. So to me, if school districts and superintendents aren't here, this is a true piece of the puzzle that we need to be looking at and just get started somehow, some way. We're 2 years in, we're not experts in this, but the communication, the conversations are powerful, and I think we're doing some great things to help our kids, especially those that are in need some way, shape, or form.
Our training video is broken into 8 parts based on the 8 steps set forth by the Secret Service in their operational guide. Those steps are: 1. Establish a multidisciplinary threat assessment team. 2. Define prohibited and concerning behaviors. 3. Create a central reporting mechanism. 4. Determine the threshold for law enforcement intervention. 5. Establish assessment procedures. 6. Develop risk management options. 7. Create and promote safe school climates. And 8. Conduct training for all stakeholders.
Before we begin with step 1, remember that all the steps and assessment methods you will learn have a single common thread: keeping children safe at school. That, in fact, is a personal mission for a Florida man named Max Schachter, who was thrust into the reality of school violence in February 2018. Schachter believes in the violence prevention power that threat assessment protocols offer and is encouraged by Ohio's focus on this approach.
My name is Max Schachter. My little boy Alex was one of the 17 victims of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas massacre. I have dedicated my life to making schools safe. After Alex was murdered, I basically put my life on hold and couldn't understand how after 9/11 we made our airport safe, and after the Oklahoma City bombing we made our federal building safe, but it's been 20 years since Columbine, and children and teachers continue to be murdered in their classrooms. And I feel that if the threat assessment had been done correctly, my little boy and the 16 others might still be alive here today. If the gun comes on campus, you've already lost the battle. If a gun makes it on campus, bad things are going to happen and a lot of people are going to die. We know that these tragedies are over in a matter of minutes. Even at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, we had an SRO on our campus, and he, on a golf cart, tried to get to the front of the building where the shooting was happening. It took him 1 minute and 44 seconds. By then, 24 people had already been shot and or killed. So if the gun arrives on campus, we're already in a very, very bad situation. So everything that Ohio is doing is trying to prevent that from happening. Threat assessments, vulnerability assessments, I think are an integral part to preventing that from ever happening. I just want to thank Ohio for doing this. I think this is critical. I wish every state took safety and security so seriously. We know that by instituting threat assessments, we can save lives. Virginia did it. They haven't had a school shooting since. I wish that we would have had threat assessments mandatory, and the training that you're doing with all of the school personnel prior to the Parkland tragedy. I feel that if the administrators at Marjory Stoneman Douglas had the proper training to do a proper threat assessment, my little boy would still be here today. The reason that every person is watching this video, the reason it's so important is because when you have these horrible events happening, it's not just the victims. The trauma and the grief that permeates the entire community, is just absolutely horrible. In many cases, you've got survivor's guilt for people that were there that day. And Parkland is not any different. We had 2 suicides after a horrible tragedy. So everybody that is listening to this video, you're doing this not only to prevent the horrible tragedy, but it's the aftermath. It's the trauma that everybody in the entire community goes through for years and years and years to come. So I want to thank everybody for watching. Alex was a wonderful little boy. He was the sweetest kid. He was the type of friend that you would want your son or daughter to be best friends with. Alex was, he loved sports. He was on the Parkland Rec basketball team. He won two championships, and he was in the band. Alex was in the marching band. He was in 9th grade, and Alex played the trombone, and he loved music. His favorite song was 25 or 6 to 4 by Chicago. He was an old soul, and we miss him tremendously.